Hello and welcome back to my channel, Booked with Holly. Today I am going over all the books I read in December. I read 4 books and I DNF'd 2 books. I will be reviewing each of these books in order of my rating, starting with my least favorite and ending with my most favorite book of the month of December. The first book that I did not finish was I Hate You, Don't Leave Me, Understanding Borderline Personality Disorder by Jerold, Kreisman, and Straus. This book I started on audio. It's the 3rd edition of this book, so I believe it's been around a while. For those of you who don't know, I am a licensed therapist and I am always looking to learn more about the various mental health diagnoses that some of my clients may be struggling with. And borderline personality disorder is one that does tend to get a bad rep in the mental health world. Individuals who are diagnosed with borderline often are seen as some of the most challenging clients to work with. And although at times that has been true in my experience, I also do find it to be very rewarding to work with individuals with borderline personality disorder and among some of the other personality disorders. I had wanted to read a book that specifically explored this diagnosis, and this is a book that kept coming up. So I gave it a try. I did find some of the information interesting in the book, specifically the research that's been done on the nature versus nurture theory as to the origins of borderline personality disorder, and had not realized that there were some genetic links, and so some of that was interesting. Unfortunately, as I was listening to the narrator of the book, I thought, wow, I've heard this voice before, and it kept making me think of a children's book that my daughter has listened to on audio, which is The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And sure enough, I looked it up and it's the same narrator who narrates I Hate You, Don't Leave Me that narrated The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And for some reason, because I have heard The Very Hungry Caterpillar so many times over and over, this man's voice just, like, I have it ingrained in me that it's like childlike, or that there's something sort of childlike about whatever he's talking about. So I don't know, that's a me issue. So the narrator I struggled with a little bit, but ultimately the reason why I decided to give up on the book was I didn't really enjoy the way people with borderline personality disorder were being discussed. There was that tone of, I don't know, there was like a tone of hopelessness or like judgment, I felt like, and it's the 3rd edition, so they were also referencing how the pandemic and even how binary politics have become in a way that sent this message of like, you're kind of doomed, like almost anything would cause somebody to develop borderline personality traits. I don't know, I didn't find it to be encouraging as I was listening to it, or even very practical for myself as a therapist. Like what might I be able to draw upon from this book that I can take to the work that I do with my clients? And the overall message and tone just felt kind of bleak and judgy. And I don't know if that was the intention for the authors, but I just found myself really like forcing myself to listen to it. And I thought, you know what, I'm trying to be better about, I don't DNF books very often, almost never. So I decided I'm going to just at least pause it, and maybe I'll come back to it at some point in the future. But for now, I let it go. The other book that I DNF'd in December was The Winter Spirits. The Winter Spirits is a collection of 12 short stories that all have a Christmas or winter ghost tale theme, sort of reminiscent of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And my understanding is that this used to be a very common tradition around Christmas time, that ghost stories were very much, during that Victorian era, part of the winter solstice and Christmas time celebration. So I was leaning into that vibe. I really wanted to read books or listen to audiobooks that had a Christmas theme, but weren't the rom-com style of Christmas book I think we tend to see. I also listened to this one on audiobook. I probably listened to maybe half of the audiobook, and generally I enjoyed it. I sort of just had my fill of it. There's something about like a collection of short stories when they're from a variety of authors, like the tone and the voice of the different stories, changes each time. It's probably a book I would revisit like next December and listen to a couple more of the stories just to get that Victorian historical fiction ghostly tale. And it's not necessarily my cup of tea, which is why I think I didn't care to listen to all the stories, but I liked it for what it was. So I don't really have anything negative to say. There was a couple of the stories that were more compelling than some of the others, but yeah, it was fine. It was fine. Generally enjoyable for that Christmas time of year. Okay, now getting into the books that I did complete in the month of December, starting with I Wrote This for Attention by Lukas Gage. It is a nonfiction book. It's a memoir. If you don't know who Lukas Gage is, he is an actor known for his role in both Euphoria and The White Lotus. I had heard that his memoir was partly an exploration of his own diagnosis with borderline personality disorder. So clearly I've been eager to learn a little bit more about this particular diagnosis and wanting to hear people's stories. So I was intrigued. I do find learning about people in Hollywood or, celebrities in general, their stories to be interesting. I like the juicy gossip and the behind the scenes probably just as much as anyone. But I also was really curious to hear what his personal experience, having been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, what his experience was like. So in this memoir, he's recounting memories from his childhood, family dynamics, some of the dysfunction in his family, themes of addiction, substance abuse, what it was like for him to navigate his parents' divorce and his development into his adolescence and young adulthood, and ultimately how his career started in acting. All the while, he's exploring these themes of the desperate want and need for attention, as he put it. And maybe another way of looking at that would be really seeking the validation and a sense of self through the eyes of other people, and ultimately how that influenced his own sort of mental health or emotional spiral and resulted in him seeking out treatment and seeing a therapist. So I found this book to be really interesting and engaging. Lukas Gage himself narrates the audiobook just to hear his voice and him telling his own story. I found his exploration of familial relationships to be really heartwarming, especially his relationship with his mom. Even the way he does her voice in the book, you really kind of get a sense of who she is. I thought it was very well written. I do wish there was a little bit more specific exploration in his borderline personality disorder diagnosis and what that really meant for him. There could have been a bit more detail involved there. And it's possible that Lukas himself might not be aware of more detail. As a therapist, I would have appreciated a little bit more insight into the diagnosis and what that really means for him. I also really appreciated his exploration of his own sexual orientation in this book. I would have liked a little bit more details in his descriptions of his time in therapy. I think that's just a personal preference. I really appreciate when a book explores how the use of therapy helped somebody. And although that's clear in this memoir that therapy was beneficial, I think that even more detail would have been really interesting for me to hear about. Ultimately, I appreciate the message of this book as being a hopeful one. Sometimes I think, especially with celebrities and their accounts of their wild years or party years, it can feel like all of that is really glamorized and then they got better. and they went to rehab or something like that. And it feels like that the journey of healing and of growth is much more brief in comparison to the accounts of like all the wild and crazy times. So I do think this book balanced that exploration of, you know, family dysfunction or trauma or substance use and his journey towards growth and healing and discovery. I think the balance was pretty good in this book, but I would have loved more on the journey of healing and therapy. Maybe we'll get another memoir by Lukas Gage at some point in another 30 years. I think this would be a great book for anyone who enjoys getting a behind the scenes of Hollywood or learning about Lukas Gage if you're a fan of his work, or if you're someone who's curious to learn a little bit more about borderline personality disorder, maybe you've been diagnosed with that yourself. I think this would be an interesting memoir to check out. It kept me interested and engaged all the way through. I enjoyed listening to it. This book I decided to give 4 stars. So that was I Wrote This for Attention by Lukas Gage, which I love that title. I think that's clever and fun. The next book I have that I read in December is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. This book centers on a woman living in a very remote area in Poland, and it's a literary fiction book with a bit of a mystery element woven into it. The woman in this book suspects that the animals in the area, like the wildlife, are taking revenge and targeting hunters that have mysteriously turned up dead or missing. If it sounds a little outlandish, it kind of is, but when you start to read this book and you get to learn more about our protagonist, she's kind of eccentric, she's a bit quirky. There's a lot of talk about astrology. She's using her knowledge of astrology to understand herself and the people around her and what's happening around her. She's someone who feels very strongly about protecting the animals in the world around us and has a very strong distaste towards hunters, towards any form of animal abuse or cruelty. So there's some really strong messaging in this book. There's also other themes just exploring how older women are generally treated, and are they taken seriously when they have something to say? Are they listened to, or are they more likely to be dismissed? So I appreciated actually both of those themes in this story. As someone who loves animals, and I can appreciate the lifestyle and the ethics of veganism or vegetarianism, I deeply understand why those perspectives are so important to people and where they come from. And at the same time, I think this book actually stirred a lot of emotions for me. I'm the daughter of a hunter and grew up with my father teaching me about the ethics of hunting in order to utilize the animal for food versus people who hunt for sport or for trophy. I also had an understanding of why some of the laws would limit hunters to only, let's say the deer population, to only hunt so many deer per season. And that was to regulate the populations in the area, and that even without hunters, overpopulation could be detrimental. And I'm no expert on any of this, but this book did make me think about the nuance of our ethics when it comes to animals and how we treat animals, what our perspective towards animals are, whether that's domestic animals or wildlife, how we're treating them when we're hunting versus farming them. And I just really was left thinking a lot about all of these aspects and the complexity. I think to sit with that nuance or that complexity can be really uncomfortable. And maybe that was the intention of this book, to encourage the reader to raise some of these questions and ask yourself, where do you stand? And where are you on the spectrum of what is okay, what's not okay? And what are your guidelines that dictate how you live your life, questions about the killing of animals for our own benefit or our own consumption. And this book clearly had a very strong message of we should not be farming or hunting animals. We should be protecting them at all costs. And yet, towards the end of this book, it turns out that the ethics are more nuanced than maybe we originally might have thought. So I did really appreciate the journey this book brought me on. I liked that there was an element of mystery. I would have loved a little bit more of the mystery element in the story. Parts in the middle, I feel like I got a little lost or distracted. The astrology, all of the astrology talk, I was completely lost with. Someone who knows little to nothing about astrology other than maybe the basics of my horoscope or my sign. It's not like I disliked those parts of the book. I just didn't really understand what they meant. I just sort of read through them and did my best to put the pieces together. I don't know if we were intended to not understand, if it was meant to sort of like seem like this woman had some incoherent thought processes. Yeah, and the pacing at a couple points, like in the middle of the book, just like wasn't really pulling my attention. But then it did pick up again. So for that reason, I really loved so much about this book. It had a very wintry vibe through the majority of it. There was a lot of snow-covered ground when they're investigating some of these mysteries. So for that, it was like a really perfect book to read in December. I gave this book 4 stars, and I would really encourage you to check it out if this sounds like something that would interest you. Okay, the next book I read in December was Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh. This book is a literary fiction novel with a bit of a dark and moody vibe to it. We're following Eileen. She's a young woman in her early 20s. She's kind of living her life in a bit of survival mode. She lives at home with her father, who's struggling with substance abuse and some mental health issues. There's a long history of some family dysfunction that we come to learn about. And she works at a juvenile correction center for boys, basically doing a lot of administrative work, but she also helps run the visiting room, and she organizes the mothers or families of these adolescent boys and coordinates them going in to visit with their families. She is quite socially isolated and very quirky, very strange. It's a little deranged to be inside her mind and hear her thoughts throughout this book. And the premise of the story is that there is a new woman who comes to work at the juvenile correction center that Eileen starts to feel like an infatuation toward. She's very intrigued by this woman. They strike up a friendship, and everything takes a bit of a twisted and dark turn. I chose to read this book in December because the plot of this book takes place in the week leading up to Christmas, and I believe the book ends on Christmas Day. So again, I wanted a Christmas type of read, but something that is more my style, which would be dark and moody and weird. And it was perfect. This book was perfect for that. I actually read this whole book in one day. I was homesick and just flew through this book. I couldn't put it down. It's very rare that I finish a book in a day. Mainly that's because I don't really have the time to finish a whole book in one day. But either way, I think that really tells you something about how much this book pulled me in. The story takes place in the 1960s in a seaside New England town just outside of Boston. Not only was this book taking place right before Christmas, but I'm also someone who lives in New England, and I also used to work in an all-men's prison. So I just couldn't not read this book. I was like, I have to read this book, and I have to read it in December. This book is like weirdly compelling. It's like one of those stories you just like can't not, you can't really look away. So, there are parts of this book that made me laugh too, just with how like deranged it got. Also, I will say, if you're someone that needs to look up trigger warnings, I would for this book. There are some potentially very triggering themes here that I won't get into because I don't want to spoil anything. all the characters in this book are ethically ambiguous. You know, there's no hero here. There's not even really a hopeful message. I would say that this is a bit of a bleak book. There's themes of family dysfunction and trauma and crime, and I guess I appreciate that. A book that doesn't feel like it has to tie everything together with like a bow and make the reader feel better. It's just sort of like this was a story and someone's life, and it is what it is, but very interesting and compelling nonetheless. Overall, I gave Eileen 5 stars. I think this book is great for anyone who's looking for a character-driven literary fiction book that doesn't shy away from a more raw and unfiltered, realistic exploration of people. It's more about the atmosphere and the psychology than it is about likable characters or hopeful messaging. And the last book I want to talk about that I read in December is called Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is a short book. I don't know if it qualifies as a novella. It is a literary fiction book taking place in Ireland in 1985. We're following our main character, who is a coal delivery driver. He has his own business and he delivers coal to all the homes in the area and the businesses in the area that utilize coal to heat their homes. On one of his deliveries to a convent, he witnesses something that puts him in a bit of an ethical dilemma. The rest of the story, we're sort of inside his mind. He's reflecting on his childhood. He's in a very pensive, introspective state. He's exploring his past as well as his present. He is a father to 6 daughters. He's just thinking about basically what to do after having witnessed the situation. It's hard to say more about the premise of the book without giving it away, but this is another book that takes place in the week leading up to Christmas. There's a lot of atmospheric, beautiful descriptions of this Irish town and the snow falling and his wife and all the girls, gathering around in the kitchen to make a Christmas cake, and has a very like dimly lit, cozy, but also a bit uneasy vibe to the book, as you're wondering, where are all these thoughts he's having going to lead him? Where is it going to take him? Ultimately, what will he decide to do, if anything, about this situation that he's witnessed? What I loved the most about this book, aside from just how beautifully it's written and how descriptive it is just being inside this man's head. This is a man who is considerate of other people. He cares about not only his own family, but the people in his community. He cares about people that are seen as societal throwaways, and he wants to still support and help people, even if it makes him feel uncomfortable or inconveniences him. He's someone that doesn't have a lot to give. He's trying to make ends meet and take care of his family. But I just found it so refreshing to see a man's perspective in this way. It's just something I think I needed. Maybe at this time in my life I needed to hear, especially having recently read the book Men Who Hate Women, which in one of my previous monthly wrap-up videos, I talk about that book. I also discuss that book in my top books of the year. December was a great month for me. I feel like I read some really wonderful books and learned to DNF books when they're just not working for me, or maybe the timing isn't right. So overall, I'm really pleased with how my reading went in the month of December. I'm excited to have discovered a couple of books that have a somewhat Christmas theme to them, but are incredible standalone stories, even without that element. They're not all Christmas vibes. I would love to know if you have read any of these books and what your thoughts were. I'm always looking for recommendations. My TBR is ever growing, and I don't mind. I hope that you are enjoying the start to your new year here in 2026, that you are reading something wonderful, and I will see you in my next monthly reading wrap up.